Let me paint you a picture, because you need to understand the world before you can understand what happened in it. Verath Prime is not a beautiful planet. I know some of the journalists who came after everything. They wrote about it like it was some sacred battlefield, some ancient place worthy of the fight that happened on it. They talked about the twin moons and the amber light, and the way the dust moved across the plateau like a living thing. And I get it, I understand why they did that. But when you're standing on Verath Prime with blood in your visor filter, and 3 squadrons of Korathi troopers burning behind you, it doesn't feel sacred. It feels like dying. The planet sits at the edge of what the Galactic Coalition calls the Fringe Corridor, that loose collection of inhabited systems that don't quite belong to any one faction, don't quite fall under any one protection treaty. You know the kind of place. Every civilization has one. The part of the map where the lines get fuzzy, where the agreements run thin, where someone always ends up paying a price that the core worlds never hear about. Verath Prime was that price. The surface is mostly flat. Enormous salt flats broken up by these jagged basalt ridges that rise up out of nowhere, like the planet itself is trying to claw at the sky. The atmosphere is breathable, barely, but the particulate count is brutal. Fine mineral dust that gets into every seal, every filter, every joint in your armor if you're not careful. By the end of a standard rotation, your visor looks like someone smeared petroleum across it from the inside. The twin moons, Set and Voron, are almost always visible during the day cycle. They sit low on the horizon in the late afternoon, amber-red against a sky that can't decide if it wants to be blue or gray. Most days it settles somewhere in between, a kind of bruised purple that makes everything look like it's already been defeated. Weather on Verath Prime runs in cycles. 3 standard rotations of dry heat, then 1 massive pressure storm that dumps electromagnetic interference across everything within a 50-kilometer radius. During a storm, long-range communications collapse, orbital surveillance goes blind, tactical feeds become static. The Korathi chose to attack during a storm. Of course they did. The Korathi are, how do I explain the Korathi to someone who's never seen them? They're big, not human big, not even Veth big. We're talking about a species that averages 2.5 meters standing, with a bilateral symmetry that doesn't quite match anything in the familiar catalog. 4 limbs for locomotion, 2 dedicated combat appendages at the upper thorax, and a sensory cluster up top that functions like a head but isn't quite one. Their exoskeletal armor integrates directly with their biological plating. The boundary between where the creature ends and the equipment begins, you genuinely can't tell. They communicate in subsonic frequencies that most species can't detect without equipment, which means that in a firefight, they coordinate in perfect silence. They talk to each other in sounds that go right through your chest without your brain ever registering them. That's terrifying, by the way, fighting an enemy that communicates in frequencies you can't hear. You see the reaction before you ever understand the signal. Korathi ground forces operate in what their military doctrine calls pressure formations. There's no subtlety to it, no attempt at deception or maneuver. They come at you in mass. Wave after wave, each formation absorbing the fire of the defenders while the next wave uses the confusion to advance. It's brutal, it's ancient, and against most coalition forces it works. It works because most coalition species have a breaking point. A threshold where the math becomes too obvious, where the survival instinct overrides the tactical training, where soldiers stop making rational decisions and start making desperate ones. The Korathi know where that point is for every species they've fought. They'd learned it for the Veth in the Outer Passage campaign. They'd learned it for the Sorrel in the Second Fringe War. They'd cataloged it for every coalition member who'd faced them in the field. They had not yet fought humans in open ground engagement. That was their mistake. I'm a Veth, 2nd Tactical Analyst, assigned to the 14th Coalition Relief Brigade, Verath Prime Garrison. My name is Sarath Ulvas, and I'm telling you this from a recovery station on Merida Station, 14 months after the battle, with a rebuilt left arm and a piece of Korathi projectile that the surgeons say is too close to my spine to remove. I'm telling you this because I was there, and because someone needs to tell it accurately. Most of the accounts you've heard, if you've heard any at all, came from the political tier. From the coalition briefings, the diplomatic summaries, the carefully worded press releases that explain the unexpected reversal at Verath Prime without ever quite explaining what actually reversed it. They don't talk about the humans in those briefings. Not directly. They talk about allied reinforcements. They talk about unexpected tactical developments. They use language that's designed to smooth over the thing that actually happened. The thing that actually happened was this. Every trained military force in the Galactic Coalition looked at the Korathi advance and concluded the battle was already over. And then a species that had been in deep space warfare for less than 60 standard years looked at the same situation and decided, for reasons that I still don't entirely understand, that the math didn't apply to them. Let me take you back to the beginning. The Coalition garrison 3 days before. The 14th Coalition Relief Brigade had been on Verath Prime for 42 standard days when the Korathi fleet appeared at the system's edge. We'd been sent there as a stabilization force. The official designation was Humanitarian Support and Infrastructure Protection, which is the Coalition's way of saying we were there to hold onto something that was quietly slipping away. Verath Prime had 3 functioning settlement colonies, a mineral extraction operation, and a population of about 40,000 non-combatants spread across the surface. The idea was that a coalition military presence would discourage any aggressive moves by the Korathi faction that had been making noise about territorial claims in the fringe corridor. The idea was wrong. The Korathi fleet, 11 warships, 2 carrier-class, 9 heavy support, dropped out of transit space in a formation that our tactical AI flagged as offensive deployment configuration before the ships had even finished decelerating. They weren't here to negotiate. They'd never planned to negotiate. Our garrison commander was a sorrel named Prethmon. I liked Preth. She was careful and methodical, and she'd been in coalition service for 30 years. She'd seen the Korathi in the field before in the Outer Passage, where she'd survived a 3-day siege by keeping her unit disciplined and her casualties managed and eventually withdrawing in good order before the situation became catastrophic. When the Korathi fleet appeared on our long-range feeds, Preth looked at the display for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, very quietly, "Request immediate orbital support and mark all non-combatant positions for emergency extraction priority." That was Preth's way of saying she knew we were in trouble. The coalition force on Verath Prime was composed of 4 species. We made up the analytical and communications corps, about 300 individuals. We're physically unimpressive. Bipedal, roughly human-proportioned but lighter and slower, with sensory processing that runs fast but bodies that don't hold up well to kinetic stress. I'm being honest. In a straight fight, a Veth is not your first choice. Sorrel about 400, mostly infantry and heavy weapons. The Sorrel are good soldiers, strong, disciplined, with a pack loyalty instinct that makes them hold formation well. They're the core of most coalition ground forces. Dreven, roughly 200, primarily engineering and logistics. The Dreven are builders. They'd spent the last 40 days constructing our defensive positions on the ridge lines, and the work was exceptional. Layered hardpoints, overlapping fields of fire, underground supply channels, 3 redundant communication relays. If we were going to hold anywhere, we'd hold on that ridge. And then there were the humans. 43 of them. 43 human soldiers from something called the 9th Expeditionary Detachment, assigned to the Coalition as part of a liaison and integration exchange program. They'd arrived on Verath Prime 26 days before the Korathi fleet, theoretically to observe Coalition operations and begin the slow process of figuring out how human military doctrine fit into a broader galactic framework. 43 humans, against a Korathi ground force that our preliminary scans estimated at somewhere between 12 and 15,000. The liaison officer, a human named Major Delara Osai, had been sitting in on our tactical briefings. She was a quiet woman, not shy, I don't think, just economical. She spoke when she had something to say, and she listened with the kind of focused attention that made you feel like she was cataloging everything. When the Korathi fleet arrived, she sat in on the emergency briefing without saying a word. She studied the fleet composition display. She looked at the estimated ground deployment numbers. She looked at our defensive positions on the ridge. Then she said, "What's your emergency extraction timeline for non-combatants?" Preth said, 48 hours for full civilian evacuation if we can hold the plateau. Osai looked at the ridge again. "We'll hold the plateau." Preth didn't respond to that, not immediately. I watched her face. Sorrel facial musculature is different from human, but I'd spent 30 years reading sorrel expressions, and what I saw there was something between pity and the particular grief of someone who doesn't want to correct a mistake, because correcting it won't change anything. She pulled up the probability model, 97.3% defeat. She showed it to Osai. Osai looked at it, and I want to describe what happened to her face when she looked at it, because I've thought about it a lot in the 14 months since. She didn't flinch, she didn't go pale. There was no visible surge of fear, no tightening of the jaw that would signal the suppression of panic. She looked at that number, 97.3%, and something happened in her eyes that I can only describe as the opposite of defeat. Like someone who'd just been told the odds and had already decided the odds were someone else's problem. She said, "Good, now I know what we're working with." The first day, the KORATHI advance. The storm hit Verath Prime 14 hours after the Korathi fleet completed its orbital deployment. Electromagnetic hell. The entire sky turned the color of a bruise that hadn't decided what it wanted to be, gray and amber, and a deep, disturbing green where the charged particle clouds were thickest. The wind came off the flats in sheets, carrying that fine mineral dust that coated everything, turned visibility to about 60 meters without sensor assistance. The Korathi began their ground deployment during the first hour of the storm. Of course they did. Their drop carriers came in low and fast, using the M interference to blind our orbital surveillance and most of our long-range ground sensors. By the time we had reliable numbers on the ground force, they had 12,000 troops formed up on the southern flat, approximately 8 kilometers from the base of the ridge, with their heavy artillery units establishing positions on the far side of the Salt Flats edge. I was at my analysis station in the primary command post, a Dreven-built structure dug into the ridge face, 2 meters of reinforced composite over our heads, 3 communication relays, and 2 independent power sources. As solid a command position as you could ask for. The kind of place where you could almost convince yourself you were just watching a simulation. Almost. The feed from our ground sensors showed the Korathi formations moving with that characteristic silence. No radio communication we could intercept. No visible signals. They just moved, 12,000 of them, with the coordination of a single organism that had decided where it was going and wasn't going to be talked out of it. Our defensive line stretched across the top of the ridge, 3 kilometers of hardpoints and overlapping positions, with the best ground the defenders were going to get anywhere on Verath Prime. The Sorrel infantry was deployed at the front positions. Dreven engineers were holding the supply lines and relay stations. Veth analysts like me were distributed through the command positions. And the 43 humans were. Actually, I didn't know where the 43 humans were. That should have told me something. Major Osa had spent the 14 hours before the storm hitting our ridge with the Dreven engineering section. I found out later what she'd been doing. She'd walked the entire defensive line, all 3 kilometers of it, with one of the Dreven engineers named Keth Oran, asking questions about load-bearing limits, fallback positions, sight lines, the underground supply channels. She'd also apparently done something that Keth Oran described to me afterward with an expression of deep confusion. She'd physically walked the approaches, gone down the face of the ridge, out into the flat, and walked the ground from the direction the Korathi would be coming from, looking at the ridge the way an attacker would see it. Keth Oran said she went out there in the dark with one of her people, just walked out onto the flat, turned around and looked at our positions for a long time. I asked her what she was doing. "What did she say?" I asked. She said she was learning the problem from the other side. I didn't fully understand that at the time. I think I do now. The first Korathi wave came at approximately 3:40 hours, 6 hours into the storm, well before first light. The storm was at its peak intensity. Visibility was essentially zero without sensors. The M interference had degraded our sensor coverage by 60%. We knew they were coming because the remaining 30% of our sensors told us so, but the picture was fragmentary. Patches of ground we could see clearly, gaps we couldn't. Preth gave the order to hold fire until they crossed the 2-kilometer marker. The Sorrel front positions held that order for 22 minutes while the Korathi advanced through the darkness and the storm. 22 minutes of knowing they were coming and not being able to see them clearly and not firing. That's extraordinary discipline. The Sorrel are good soldiers. At 2 kilometers, Preth gave the order. The ridge lit up. Energy weapon discharge at that scale creates a particular kind of light, a hard, flat brightness that has no warmth in it, that turns the dust clouds into something that looks almost solid, like you could reach out and touch the light itself. The thermal bloom from the Dreven-built heavy emplacements rolled down the slope in waves. And the Korathi came through it. That's the thing about a pressure formation. You can hurt it. You can inflict casualties that would stop any other tactical approach dead. But the mathematics of the thing are built around the fact that the next wave is already moving before the first one stops. The losses of the front element are factored in. They're expected. They're the cost that the commanders have decided is acceptable in exchange for the advancing tide. We killed a lot of Korathi in those first 40 minutes. They kept coming. By 500, they were at 800 meters. By 5:30, they were at 400. The front Sorrel positions were taking fire. Not heavy yet, the storm was making accuracy difficult for both sides, but taking fire. At 5:45, I ran the updated numbers. Defeat probability, 94%. We'd shifted the curve by 3 points. In 40 minutes of hard fighting. I looked at that number and thought about what 3 points meant. It meant we'd hurt them. It meant we'd made them pay. It didn't mean we were going to win. Preth was at the command console across from me. She was calm. The Sorrel are always calm in combat. It's the same pack loyalty that holds their formations. The individual suppresses panic because panicking breaks the pack. She was coordinating the front positions with the kind of focused precision that you only see in people who have accepted that the situation is what it is and are going to do their jobs until they can't anymore. I was about to tell her the numbers when she said, "Where is Osai?" I checked. Major Osai's locator signal was not at the command post. Not at any of the rear defensive positions. It was at the forward left flank. The position closest to the Korathi advance. Sergeant Preth Korath, no relation to the commander, ran the left flank position. He was a Sorrel veteran, 15 years in service, exactly the kind of hard, experienced soldier you want holding a critical position. Later, when I spoke to him, he described what happened at the left flank starting from about 4:30. The 43 humans had arrived at the left flank position 2 hours before the Korathi reached their line. Osai had split them into 4 elements. 12 soldiers at the far point of the left flank, where the ridge dipped down and created a natural approach corridor, the most vulnerable section of the defensive line. 12 more at a secondary position about 200 meters back, with clear fire lanes down the approach corridor. 8 at a position Osai had identified on the ridge face itself, not at the top, but halfway down, in a series of natural rock formations that provided cover, and critically, a firing angle that went perpendicular to the main Korathi axis of advance. And the remaining 11 were doing something that Korath couldn't immediately explain. They were digging. Not building a position, Korath told me. Not reinforcing the hardpoints, just digging, with equipment I didn't recognize, making holes in the ground on the approach slope. He'd asked Osai what they were doing. She'd said adjusting the terrain. Korath had been in coalition service long enough to know that you don't argue with a field officer who's calm and purposeful in the middle of an impending engagement, even if you don't understand what they're doing. He let them dig. At 3:45, with the Korathi 800 meters out, Major Osai found Korath and said without preamble, "When they hit your line, do not fall back immediately. Wait for my signal. You'll know what it is." Korath said, "What is the signal?" Osai said, "You'll know." Then she went to the forward point position with her 12 soldiers and disappeared into the storm. The Korathi hit the left flank at 5:47. They hit it hard, a dedicated thrust element, about 800 troops, specifically targeting the approach corridor that Osai had identified as the weak point. Because of course they had. The Korathi had done their own reconnaissance. They'd identified the same vulnerability. The front position erupted. Energy fire from both sides. The storm light and the weapon light mixing into something chaotic and almost beautiful in a terrible way. Korath's Sorrel unit was holding, but the pressure was extraordinary. 800 Korathi in a corridor that narrowed the front to about 40 meters, the pressure formation doing exactly what it was designed to do. And then Osai's signal happened. Ulkorath described it this way: I heard a sound. Even through the storm, through the firefight, through everything, I heard a sound I couldn't identify, not a weapon system I recognized, not a signal tone, a sound that was low and building. The 11 humans who'd been digging had finished their work. What they dug, positioned along the approach slope at intervals of about 30 meters, were a series of shaped charge arrays, not the Dreven-built emplacements that were part of the official defensive design. Human ordnance, material that Osai's detachment had brought as part of their exchange equipment, and that nobody in the Coalition command structure had thought to inventory or ask about. The charges went in a sequence, not simultaneous, sequential, timed, walking up the approach corridor from the base toward the ridge. The first one took out the ground under the front element of the Korathi thrust. The second one, 2 seconds later, hit the next element as they were still reacting to the first. Third, fourth, fifth, each one precisely spaced, walking the detonations up the corridor like a fist coming down a table. The geological effect of 5 sequential charges in that narrow corridor. The Dreven engineers were the ones who explained this to me afterward, with a kind of professional awe that was almost funny given the circumstances, was to collapse the natural drainage structure of the approach slope. The ground that had been solid became shifting. The corridor that had been a Korathi advantage became something they were sinking into. 800 Korathi in a collapsing approach corridor. And Osai's forward position, those 12 humans at the very tip of the spear, opened fire into the confusion from a range of about 60 meters. I want to say something about that. 60 meters. The standard engagement range for coalition forces against Korathi is 400 meters minimum. The doctrine, solid, tested, based on the casualties that result from closer engagement, is to never let them get close. Their physical capability at close range is decisive. You don't let Korathi get to 60 meters. Osai's forward element was at 60 meters, and choosing to be there. I need to stop here and tell you something about human soldiers that I didn't understand before Verath Prime. I had studied human military history as part of my analyst training. The Coalition requires it for anyone working in integrated operations. The history is, it's a lot. Humans have been fighting each other for their entire recorded history, which runs back several thousand standard years if you count the ancient documented conflicts, and the sheer variety and duration and intensity of it is actually difficult for a non-human analyst to fully process. What I'd taken from my study of human military history was that humans were effective fighters with a tendency toward innovation and adaptability, higher pain tolerance than most species of similar mass, strong unit cohesion driven by what their psychological literature calls band of brothers, bonding, intense loyalty to the immediate group that persists under extreme stress. What I had not fully understood, what the textbooks don't quite capture, is the specific thing that makes human soldiers different from every other species I'd encountered in a military context. Every species has a threshold, a point where the individual calculus says this is too much. Humans have the threshold. Of course they do. They're not invulnerable. They're not suicidal. They understand danger. They process fear. I've seen the neuroscience in their own literature, the amygdala response, the cortisol spike, the physical manifestations of fear that are remarkably well documented for a species that clearly finds the subject uncomfortable. But somewhere in the human military tradition, built across thousands of years of fighting each other in situations that most species would look at and say, this is not survivable, and therefore not worth attempting. They developed a relationship with that threshold that I have never seen in any other species. They don't cross it, they treat it as a target. When the situation gets bad enough that the threshold says stop, human soldiers use that information not as a signal to withdraw, but as a signal that this is where they're needed. The worse the situation, the more a certain kind of human soldier seems to settle in. I didn't understand that on day 1. I understood it by the end of day 3. At the left flank, after the corridor charges went off, after the initial chaos hit the Korathi thrust element, there were approximately 600 Korathi still functional and pressing toward the position. 600 versus 12 at the forward point, backed up by 20 and 8 at the secondary positions. 40 humans total. The Sorrel unit under Ulkorath was about 200 meters back, watching. Ulkorath told me, I was preparing the signal to fall back. By every doctrine I know, by every piece of training I have, that position was untenable. I was ready to call the withdrawal. He paused, and then I looked at the forward position. He paused again, longer. They weren't falling back. Here is what I know about what happened at the forward position during the next 4 hours. I know it from 3 sources. Sergeant Ulkorath's account of what he could observe from 200 meters back, the sensor records that survived the M interference, and the testimony of the humans themselves. 3 of them give an informal debrief at Merida Station, 11 months after the battle. I'm going to try to give you all of it. Major Osai's forward element, 12 humans, held the approach corridor for 4 hours against what eventually totaled 900 Korathi troops cycling through that sector. Not 900 at once. The Korathi rotated elements. The pressure formation depends on fresh troops maintaining constant pressure, and for 4 hours, that sector saw fresh Korathi rotated in every 40 minutes. The 12 humans did not rotate. Sergeant First Class Tomas Breck, he was one of the 3 who testified, described the first 2 hours this way. We had good cover. The rock outcropping gave us 360 observation and solid front-facing protection. Osai had prepositioned our crew systems, the 2 mounted systems we'd brought, at angles that gave us perpendicular fire into the corridor. The collapsed ground from the charges was helping us. Korathi formations don't adapt quickly to terrain disruption. They're built for momentum. When the momentum breaks, there's a pause before they reconfigure. He said we used every pause. When I asked him what that meant specifically, he was quiet for a moment. Every time their formation broke and reformed, we moved, changed positions, made them recalibrate their fire solutions. We didn't stay in one spot long enough for them to dial us in. The Major had drilled us on it. She called it making yourself expensive. Every time you make them work to target you, that's time and attention and ammunition they're spending instead of advancing. What about casualties? I asked. He looked at his hands. We took casualties, he said. By hour 2, we were down to 9. Kowalczyk was gone. DeMarco and Obi were down but functional. 9 down from 12 in 2 hours. Against standard coalition doctrine, that's a unit at critical threshold. The point where effectiveness degrades because the losses have disrupted the structure enough that the unit can't function as designed. I said, at what point did you consider withdrawal? He looked at me like I'd asked the question in a language he didn't speak. We couldn't withdraw, he said. If we pulled back, the corridor was open. The Sorrel line would take the full weight of 900 Korathi with no corridor disruption, no secondary engagement, no anything. We'd set this up to hold, so we held. I said, but at 9 effective, against the numbers you were facing. We weren't doing math, he said. Not that math, we were doing one question. Can we hold this position right now in this moment? And the answer kept being yes, so we kept holding. The second human who testified was Corporal Yuna Takahashi. She was 26 standard years old. She had a calm, matter-of-fact manner that reminded me oddly of Osai, that same economy of expression. She described herself as the element's technical specialist, responsible for maintaining the 2 crew-served systems and managing the ammunition loadout. By hour 3, she said, we were at about 30% primary ammunition. The crew systems were at 40%. Major Osai made the call to shift to selective fire only, no suppression. Every shot was an aimed shot at a confirmed target. She said that's when it got quiet. I asked her to explain what she meant. Before we were laying down a lot of fire, volume, creating the impression of more force than we had. Once we went to selective, the fire rate dropped. There's a period when the enemy recognizes the change in fire rate and has to figure out what it means. Is it an ambush position? Are they out of ammunition? Are they withdrawing? Every time they tried to press while figuring it out, we made them pay for it. But the pauses got longer. She described one of those pauses. Around hour 3, there was a gap of about 12 minutes where no Korathi were advancing. They'd pulled the current element back. We could see the movement in the sensor feed. They were regrouping, reforming for another push. What did your element do during those 12 minutes? I asked. Major Os had Breck consolidate our ammunition. She had me run a systems check on the crew equipment. She had the rest of the element eat. I stopped. Eat. Standard field ration. She said, and this is exact because I've thought about it a lot, she said. We don't know how long this goes. Eat now while we have the time. Corporal Takahashi looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I wasn't hungry, she said. None of us were hungry. That's an adrenaline response, appetite suppression under acute stress. But she told us to eat, so we ate. And I think it was because eating was a normal thing. It was a thing you do when you're okay. And doing normal things when everything is not normal is how you stay functional. The third witness was Specialist Darren Ashworth, 23, the youngest member of the forward element. He was harder to talk to, not uncooperative, just quieter. He had a particular stillness that you see sometimes in people who have been through something they haven't finished processing. He described Hour 4. We were at 7 functional. Osai, me, Breck, Takahashi, and 3 others. Crew systems were at 12%. Primary ammunition across the element was maybe enough for 20 minutes of sustained action. And the Korathi, I asked. Still coming, he said. They'd rotated in a new element. Maybe 300 in the corridor, with heavy weapon support that they'd managed to get close enough to matter. We were taking fire on our cover that was actually starting to degrade the rock. Another 30 minutes, and our position was going to stop being a position. I said, what was Major Osa doing? He was quiet. She was on the communicator, he said. Not the coalition tactical net, our unit frequency. She was talking to someone, I could hear her, but not the other end, she said. He stopped. She said, I need 20 more minutes on the left flank. Can you give me 20 minutes? And then she listened. And then she said, outstanding, bring it loud. He looked at me. I didn't know who she was talking to. I was focused on my sector. I just filed it away. I said, what happened 20 minutes later? And Specialist Ashworth, for the first time in the interview, almost smiled. There was something in his eyes that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, the expression of someone recalling something that still surprises them even in retrospect. The ridge stopped being quiet, he said. What PRETHMAAN saw from the command post. Let me come back to what I personally saw, because I want to give you that perspective, the view from the command post, from the data feeds, from the tactical display. By Hour 4 of the engagement, the overall coalition position was worse than when it started. The right flank had held, but the Korathi had found an approach vector around the right anchor point that our sensor coverage had missed. We'd repositioned 2 Sorrel companies to cover it, which thinned the center. The center was taking sustained artillery fire. Not catastrophic, the Dreven hardpoints were holding, but wearing. The kind of constant attrition that's designed to exhaust defenders rather than destroy them. You can absorb a lot of fire when you're dug in, but absorbing it costs concentration, costs energy, costs the mental and physical resources that you need to respond when the real thrust comes. I had run the updated numbers at 740 hours. Defeat probability, 91%. We'd moved the curve, 6 more points. The humans at the left flank, specifically, had absorbed and held a thrust element that should have collapsed that sector in 40 minutes. They'd held it for 4 hours. And yet, 91% is not encouragement. 91% is a different flavor of the same conclusion. Preth was at the command console. Her face was doing that thing, the grief calm, the acceptance that's not giving up but is very close to it. I was about to update her on the numbers when our communication relay lit up. A signal on the coalition tactical net coming from I checked twice because it didn't make sense from the southern transit approach, the direction the Korathi had come from. I said, Commander, signal on the tactical net. Southern approach vector. Preth said, that's impossible. That's Korathi-controlled space at this point. I said, I know. The signal resolved. It was a human military identification code, not Osai's detachment, a different code, a different unit designation. I ran it through the coalition registry. 9th Expeditionary Detachment, Support Element, Human Carrier Vessel INS Perseverance. Support Element, what had been described to us in the original liaison briefing as a logistics and observation support vessel that would remain in the outer system during the engagement. It was not in the outer system. It was on an attack vector toward the southern approach. Preth stared at the display. "How?" she said quietly, not demanding, not angry, just how. I looked at the approach data, at the timing of their transit, at when they would have had to have started moving to be where they were. The INS Perseverance had started moving toward Verath Prime 16 hours before the Korathi attack, before the storm, before the engagement. Os had known what was coming. She'd positioned her support element before anyone else had figured out what was happening. And she hadn't told us, because if she'd told us, it would have changed our behavior. It would have given Preth options she didn't have before, and Preth making different decisions with different information might have disrupted whatever Osai was setting up. She'd played the whole thing. From the moment the Korathi fleet appeared, she'd been running a plan that the rest of us couldn't see. Preth said, "What is the Perseverance's armament?" I pulled the human military exchange documentation. The Perseverance was described as a medium-class support and strike vessel, which in human military classification meant, I cross-referenced, a ship carrying 3 independent strike wings, 4 heavy orbital bombardment systems, and what the documentation cheerfully described as a comprehensive electronic warfare suite. Coming in from the south, coming in from behind the Korathi fleet's primary positioning. Coming in loud. The Perseverance. I wasn't able to observe the orbital engagement directly. I was in the command post. What I saw was the effect on our tactical feeds, the sudden restoration of sensor coverage as the Perseverance's electronic warfare systems engaged and began actively countering the M interference. The tactical display going from static-filled fragments to something almost complete. And the Korathi fleet beginning to react. They hadn't expected a threat from the south. Their orbital formation was positioned to support the ground operation, primary systems facing the Coalition's known assets, the 2 carrier-class ships holding station above the Korathi ground forces' axis of advance. The Perseverance came in at an angle that put the 2 carriers directly between it and the rest of the fleet. The Korathi ships began to rotate, to reposition, to face the new threat, which meant they were no longer facing our direction, which meant our 2 remaining Coalition orbital support assets, 2 medium-weight platforms that had been suppressed under the Korathi fleet's attention since the engagement began, suddenly had maneuver room they hadn't had before. Preth saw it at the same moment I did. She said, "Signal orbital units 7 and 9, aggressive repositioning, coordinate with Perseverance approach." She was already on the communicator. And here is the thing I want you to understand about what Osai had done. She hadn't saved us, not by herself, not with 43 people and 1 medium-class strike vessel. She hadn't walked in and magically reversed the odds. What she had done was find the lever. The exact point where an action of a specific kind, applied with the right timing, would create not just a direct effect but a cascading one. The Korathi fleet repositioning created space for our orbital assets. Our orbital assets repositioning created pressure that the Korathi ground commanders had to respond to. Korathi ground commanders responding to orbital pressure had to begin pulling resources from the ground advance. And the ground advance, already under pressure from the left flank holdout, from the collapsed approach corridor, from 43 humans who had refused to move, was about to face something it hadn't calculated for. The strike wings. I'm going to tell you what Corporal Takahashi described next, because she saw it before I did. She was at the left flank forward position. Hour 4, 7 humans functional, crew systems at 12%, position degrading. She heard the communicator exchange, OS, asking for 20 minutes getting confirmation. And then, at approximately minute 17 of those 20 minutes, she looked up. "They came in low," she said. "Really low. Below the storm layer, which I'm not a pilot, I don't know how that's possible in an M storm, but they were below it. 3 aircraft, moving fast." She said, "I'd never seen them fly that low." The Perseverance's strike wings came in below the storm layer, using terrain masking, the ridge itself, the basalt formations of the plateau, to approach the Korathi ground forces' concentrated formations from below their sensor horizon. 3 aircraft, each one carrying, I got the loadout from the debrief documentation, a weapons package that was described, with the same cheerful understatement that characterized all the human military exchange documentation, as area denial and formation disruption ordnance. They flew the length of the Korathi ground formation. Not a single pass, not a strafing run. A systematic, deliberate flight path that took them directly over the concentrated center of the Korathi ground force, the 12,000 troops that had been advancing across the salt flat for 4 hours, that had been absorbing our fire and pressing forward in that relentless pressure formation. The result was not the destruction of the Korathi ground force. I want to be clear about that. 12,000 troops is a lot of troops, and 3 aircraft, even carrying what those aircraft were carrying, cannot destroy 12,000 troops. What they did was break the formation. The pressure formation depends on cohesion, on the waves moving in sequence, on the front absorbing fire while the next wave advances, and the next, and the next. The mathematics of it only works when the formation maintains its structure. 3 aircraft, carrying area denial ordnance, flying the length of a formation that was designed for forward momentum and not for distributed, dispersed defense. They broke it. Not destroyed, disrupted, fragmented. The leading elements already pressed against the ridge suddenly cut off from the rear elements. The rear elements, suddenly under air attack, dispersing and losing cohesion. The communications between Korathi units, those subsonic frequencies that we couldn't intercept, suddenly having to bridge gaps in the formation that hadn't existed 10 minutes ago. A pressure formation that's been disrupted is not a pressure formation anymore. It's just a lot of Korathi in a place, trying to figure out what the situation is. And while they were figuring it out, the SORAL counterattack. Preth called it at 8:12 hours. All Sorrel forward units, counterattack, ridge line to salt flat margin now. I looked up from my console when she said it, not because I didn't understand the order, because of the word now, the urgency of it, the certainty. Preth Mon, who had spent 30 years in coalition service, who had survived 3 major engagements through careful management of impossible situations, who had shown me the 97.3% probability model with the particular grief of someone who knew what it meant. Preth Mon was ordering a counterattack. Because the window existed. For the first time since the Korathi fleet had appeared on our feeds, the window existed. The Sorrel infantry came off the ridge. 400 of them, not cautious, not managed, fast, moving down the slope into a Korathi ground force that was disrupted, confused, and cut off from its own orbital support by a ship that had appeared from the south and was currently making the Korathi fleet commanders' lives very complicated. The fighting on the Salt Flat lasted 6 hours. I'm not going to pretend I can describe that in full. I can give you the analysis version, unit positions, casualty rates, tactical developments. But the battle on the Salt Flat isn't really my story to tell. That's the Sorrel infantry's story. That's Preth's story. What I can tell you is that at 14:20 hours, the Korathi ground force commander, a senior Korathi military officer whose designation translates roughly as First Advance Coordinator, transmitted a formal disengagement signal. The Korathi were withdrawing. Not in rout, not in panic, in their characteristic organized way, maintaining formation discipline even in withdrawal. They took their dead and their wounded. They moved in sequence. Even retreating, they were impressive. But they were retreating. After the disengagement signal, I left the command post. I needed to see the left flank. The walk down the ridge took about 20 minutes. The storm was dying, not gone, but weakening, the particle density dropping enough that visibility had opened to about 200 meters. The amber light of Set and Vorin was coming through the thinning clouds, giving the Salt Flat that quality the journalists would later call sacred, and that I called heartbreaking. Ulkarath met me at the approach to the forward position. He was a big sorrel, not that I'm in any position to judge size, but he was built like what he was, a soldier's soldier, built for exactly this kind of work. He looked at me when I came down the path, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. I said, "How many?" He said, 4. 4 out of 12. 4 humans still functional at the end of 4 hours in the forward position. I said, "The Major." He nodded, "She's functional." He paused. "I watched them," he said. "The whole time, I was 200 meters back and I watched them. I've been a soldier for 15 years. I've served with Sorel, Veth, Dreven, 2 rotations with Sorel Special Operations. I have never. He stopped, started again. At hour 2, one of them was down. Injured, not gone, but down, and the one next to him not stopping, not slowing, taking care of the injured soldier while still holding the position. Both things at once, like it was just a task, like you could just add a task to a task and do them both. He looked at the position. At hour 3, they were moving, under fire, between positions, not running, moving like they'd choreographed it, like they'd practiced exactly this situation in exactly this terrain. He said, "They're strange." I said, "Yes." He said, "I mean that as the highest thing I know how to say about a soldier." I said, "I know." I found Major Osai sitting on a piece of fallen basalt at the edge of the forward position. The position itself was significantly changed from whatever it had been before the engagement. The rock formations that had provided cover were marked with the thermal scarring of energy weapon impacts. The ground around the position was stripped and churned, the mineral surface turned to something that looked almost soft by the violence done to it. Osai was sitting on her basalt, eating. A field ration, same as what she'd had her element eat during hour 3 when the Korathi pulled back to regroup. She looked up when I approached. Her armor was damaged. The right shoulder plate had taken a hit that hadn't penetrated but had deformed the composite significantly. There was a repair seal over a section of her visor. She didn't look like someone who just held a position for 4 hours against 900 Korathi. She looked like someone who was thinking about something. I sat down near her, not too close. I didn't know her well enough to judge the distance, and it felt important to get that right. I said 97.3. She looked at me. "That was the defeat probability when you arrived at this position," I said. 97.3%. She said, "I know. You looked at that number and—" "I looked at it," she said. "And then I looked at the terrain, and I looked at the fleet composition data, and I thought about what we had versus what they had." She ate a bite of her field ration. "The number assumes everyone operates the same way," she said. "Same response curves, same threshold behaviors. The models are built on data, and the data comes from how the coalition species have behaved historically in similar situations." She looked out at the salt flat. "We don't have a lot of historical data in the coalition's models," she said. "We're new." I said, "You knew about the Perseverance. You positioned it before the attack." She didn't deny it. "I had a hypothesis about the Korathi fleet positioning. If they were going to use the storm for cover, they'd concentrate their orbital assets on the primary threat axis. That leaves the southern approach, longer transit, not a standard approach vector, but viable if you're willing to run hot." "Why didn't you tell Commander Mon?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because the value of the southern approach is surprise. If Commander Mon knew the Perseverance was coming, it would change her tactical decisions. She might have held assets in reserve differently. She might have told people. Any change in behavior that the Korathi sensors could pick up would tell them something was different." She looked at me directly. "And I might have been wrong," she said. "If my hypothesis was wrong and the Perseverance committed early based on Commander Mon's changed behavior, we lose the ship. I wasn't willing to risk that on a hypothesis." I said, "So you risked your people instead." She didn't look away. "Yes," she said, "that's the job. You pick the risk you can manage." The final casualty count from the Battle of Verath Prime was as follows. Coalition forces, 217 dead, 389 wounded. The Veth Analyst Section lost 4. The Sorel Infantry lost 140. The Dreven Engineering Corps lost 61. The humans 8 dead, 14 wounded. From 43 soldiers. The Korathi ground force. The coalition estimate is between 2,200 and 2,600 casualties, with the recovery and count being imprecise due to the nature of the battlefield. The Korathi fleet sustained significant damage, 2 heavy support ships destroyed, 1 carrier class severely compromised. The fleet withdrew within 18 hours of the ground force disengagement. Verath Prime remained in coalition hands. The non-combatant evacuation, the 40,000 civilians who'd been the reason for the garrison in the first place, completed within 36 hours of the battle's end. They were processed through emergency transit at Merida Station. Some of them eventually returned to Verath Prime. Some didn't. The debriefs. The formal debrief of the Verath Prime engagement took 6 weeks at Merida Station. I participated in parts of it. Not all. There were aspects above my clearance level, and there were aspects where the human military observers took the room and requested coalition analysts step out. What I can tell you about the debrief is what came out of it. The coalition reviewed our defeat probability models and found them accurate. Every assumption the models made about coalition species behavior was correct. The Veth, the Sorrel, the Dreven, we had all performed within predictable parameters. The models were not equipped to predict human behavior. Specifically, the models had no historical data on human response to overwhelmed scenarios. They had no calibration for the specific human threshold response that I've described, the phenomenon where worsening odds produce, in a certain category of human soldier, not increased probability of withdrawal, but increased probability of escalation. The debrief committee, which included, I should note, 2 senior Korathi military observers who attended under the formal post-engagement consultation protocol, spent a full day on this specific question. The Korathi observers were quiet for most of it. At the end, one of them communicated through the translation system, something that I have thought about many times since. They said, and the translation is imperfect, as Korathi communication always is through our systems, they said. We have cataloged the threshold of every species we have fought. We will need to recatalog. The debrief committee chair asked, what will your recatalog say? The Korathi observer was quiet for a long time. Then, that the human threshold exists, but that the cost of reaching it is unlike anything we have encountered, and that we do not know what exists on the other side of it. I spoke to Major Osai twice more during the debrief period. The first time was formal. I was being debriefed about the analytical section's performance, and she was there as part of the integrated exchange review. Professional, precise. She answered questions about the timing of the Perseverance's deployment, and the decision tree behind the left flank positioning with the same economy she brought to everything. The second time was not formal. I found her on the observation deck of Merida Station. It was the 4th week of the debrief, and I'd been having trouble sleeping. The piece of Korathi projectile near my spine was already making itself known, though it wouldn't be formally identified for another 2 months. I was looking at the star field, which is the kind of thing you do when you can't sleep and you've run out of analysis to run. She was already there. We stood there for a while without saying anything. The observation deck has a long viewport, and the section of space visible from it includes the general direction of Verath Prime, though you can't see the system from that angle. Just the general direction. Eventually, I said, the numbers said 97.3. She said, I know. Do you think about it, what they said, that you weren't running the same calculation? She was quiet for a moment. I was running the same calculation, she said. She stopped, started again. The calculation isn't wrong, the numbers were real. If everything had stayed exactly as it was, with exactly the assets that were visible at that moment, performing exactly as the models predicted, 97.3 was probably right. But the models don't have a line item for what a person decides to do, she said. They model behavior based on historical data. They say, here is how this type of unit has responded to this type of situation historically. And the model is good. It's useful. You should use it. She looked out at the stars. It just doesn't know what's possible, she said. It knows what's happened. That's not the same thing. I thought about that. I said, 8 of your people didn't come home. I said it gently. I didn't intend it as an accusation. But I needed to say it because it was true, and because I think sometimes the things that are true and painful need to be said out loud by someone. She didn't flinch, but something in her face, something that was usually very still, moved. I know, she said. Do you think about them? Every day, she said without hesitation. Every single day. We were quiet after that. Eventually, she said, the 217 coalition casualties, the 40,000 civilians on Verath Prime, the mission. She said it simply, not as justification, not as a calculation that made the 8 acceptable. just as the other part of the thing, the part that also has to live in you alongside the 8. I understood it. I don't know if I could carry it the way she seemed to carry it. That specific human thing of holding contradictions without letting them collapse you. Maybe that's something you build over time. Or maybe it's something you're shaped toward by a history that's always been full of impossible choices and people who had to make them. The Korathi did not return to Verath Prime. They did not formally withdraw their territorial claim. Korathi diplomatic processes don't work that way. They simply stopped pressing it. The fleet that had appeared at the system's edge with 11 ships was replaced by a patrol presence, then by nothing. The official coalition Korathi communication about Verath Prime slowed to a trickle over the following months and eventually stopped. The settlements rebuilt. The mineral extraction operation restarted. The 40,000 civilians who'd been evacuated gradually came back, most of them. About 6,000 chose not to return, which is their right. The ridge where we held the Dreven hardpoints, the approach corridor with the collapsed ground from Osai's charges, that became something of a landmark. Not officially. The coalition doesn't name battlefields, but the settlement residents gave it a name in the local dialect. Veth translation renders it approximately as the place where the new ones held. I think about that name. The new ones, 60 years in deep space, measured against civilizations that have been traveling between stars for thousands. New. But on that ridge, in that storm, against those numbers, the new ones held. What it means. I've been an analyst for 30 years. My job is to make sense of data, to take complex situations and reduce them to something that can be understood, modeled, predicted. I don't have a clean model for what I saw on Verath Prime. What I have is this. Every species in the Galactic Coalition calculates survival. We look at the situation, we run the numbers consciously or instinctively, and when the numbers say this is not survivable, we make adjustments. We fall back, we negotiate, we withdraw, we accept the loss. That's rational. That's intelligent. That's what organisms with self-preservation instincts and functional decision-making capacity do. Humans do this too. They're not irrational. They're not suicidal. They process the same information and run the same calculus. They just sometimes, when the math says it's over, they look at the math and say, let's see. Not because they don't believe the math. Not because they're stupid or reckless or don't understand what the numbers mean. I think it's because somewhere in them, built by thousands of years of fighting each other, and fighting their own planet and fighting every hard thing that their history threw at them, somewhere in them, there's a belief that the situation is not the final word. That the numbers describe what has happened and not what has to happen. That the gap between 97.3 and 100 is, in some important sense, where they live. I don't know how to quantify that. I don't know how to put it in a model. I don't know if it's an asset or a liability or both simultaneously. I do know that I watched 43 humans walk onto a battlefield that every analysis said was already lost. And I watched them decide it wasn't. 14 months after Verath Prime, I'm sitting in a recovery bay on Merida Station with a rebuilt left arm and a piece of metal that's staying where it is. I still run numbers, it's what I do, old habits. But I find myself, sometimes, adding a variable that wasn't in my training. A variable that I don't have a coefficient for, that I'm not sure can be quantified. I call it, in my personal notes, the human term. The thing that the models don't know how to account for. The thing that lives in the space between what the data predicts and what people actually choose to do. 43 soldiers, 900 Korathi, a battle that was already over. Until it wasn't. That's the part no model predicted. And the reason it mattered, the only reason any of it mattered, wasn't the tactical doctrine or the prepositioned strike ship or the improvised ordnance in the approach corridor. It was 8 people who didn't come home and 35 who did, and a major sitting on a piece of basalt eating a field ration because you eat when you have time, because you don't know when the next chance is, because the work isn't done until it's done. It was a window that shouldn't have existed, and a species that knew exactly how to climb through it.